series, Anton, Nelessen. I appreciate everyone coming out tonight. I know it's thesis reviews. I know it's the end of the year. I know it's a really busy time in our college. We have many different events going on tonight. So thanks, first of all, for coming. Secondly, I'd like to draw your attention to one change in the lecture series, and that is a week from tonight, that's the 22nd of April, 1 week from tonight at 8 p.m. will be our final lecture of the year, and that is by Mauro Workshops, whose work is one of the group of Mexican architects illustrated in the gallery exhibit that just went up this week, Monday. So it should be a really excellent kind of capstone to our series this year, and I hope that you all can find the time to come back out for our final lecture. So again, that's Wednesday at 8 p.m., 1 week from tonight. Tonight we're really lucky to have someone in the audience who is teaching with us, Shoshkes, who actually has had the privilege and pleasure of working with our speaker tonight. And she has been with us this year, teaching in the first year program here at CAP, and as an assistant professor here in the planning department. So I'd like now to introduce Shoshkes to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Nothing. I got to know Tony because I was his teaching assistant at Rutgers, where I'm finishing my PhD right now, so in my role as student. And at Rutgers, I can tell you Tony is sort of a revered figure, sort of a larger-than-life character, not only because he's become a sort of a spokesman for the new urbanism movement and because he's one of these pioneers in the use of this visioning technique, but he's constantly flying around to incredibly glamorous places and working on very glamorous assignments in South Africa, the Netherlands, Belgium, and all across America. So he definitely has this air of glamour, and he attracts a lot of students to him for that. But it's also his new book, Visions of a New American Dream. It's also becoming a kind of a classic, an immediate overnight classic standard for the text. And I think that the fact that all of you have come out when you could be doing so many other things shows that Tony, you're well known and well loved here too. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Tony to come up and talk to you. Oh, you're going to do this?
I like to pace when I talk. So I was told that there's certain limits of which I could do, but it's always found that if I get closer to people, I actually can look them in the eye, and I get some kind of reading as to whether they believe me or not. I'm wearing my sprawl hat tonight. As you can see, it says on it, "Grow smart, stop sprawl." I'm around the country, and I am becoming more and more convinced every day that it is absolutely imperative that we reach audiences like you here to kind of entice you, if you're not already into it, to save for your generation the future, not only of this country, but I think of urbanism. And that's the thing that I'm going to continue to refine during the course of this lecture tonight, is that we need people who are visually trained to be able to help in the interpretation of what we want the future to be. It's not a matter of just waiting for the future to happen. It's a matter of becoming proactive to the point of determining what it can be. I think those of you who are in planning theory or planning history kind of fully understand the paradigms that happened in the 20s and the Depression, and they understand the whole issue of the World's Fair 1938, 1939 as kind of the image of what America would become. And we became that. Muncie became that. The strip sprawl between here and every city in the United States became that. And this new generation inherits this mess. And that particular mess has got to be corrected in both our lifetimes and your lifetimes. And now we're finding that there's an entirely new group of people out there to take responsibility in making this change occur. And I am convinced that because so many people are so visually illiterate, that it requires a training of planning, or what I find fascinating about the school is that there's a visual training where the architects, the landscape architects, the planners, the historic preservation folks are together in one place to be able to see this synthesis really begin to occur. And that is really critical, because I'm convinced in my work for now close to 35 or 40 years that people, 99% of the people cannot read a site plan. They have no idea what they're looking at. They have no idea what an elevation is. They cannot relate an elevation to a plan. They cannot relate an elevation and a plan to the environmental impact studies. And how do you have those tools which will allow people to begin to do that, so that not just you, the elite, can understand that, but you now have a moral and ethical responsibility, in my opinion, to translate what you have as a technique down to everyone else, so that we can get the kind of urbanism which is needed and necessary in order to give this place a kind of a vitality, an ecological sustainability, a kind of spiritual sense of place that we have lost in the last 30 and 40 years. In my opinion, I think a lot of that is really going to be left to the next generation. Now, you can have the slides. Now, there's some of the things that you'll see here tonight. Now, for those of you that are planners in the audience, and I don't mean to undercut any of the planners, because what I like about the school is that those folks who are involved with planning in the three-dimensional sense, to me, all follow under this very pejorative and very large notion of being a part of that extraordinary creative process. And I want to talk the thing called vision to actual implementation. Now, what I thought was one of the more important things in this whole process was the first effects on zoning regulations on the design of communities. And I love this. It was the front page of the cover of Planning magazine. And we think about the decisions, the legal decisions that were made, Euclid and what have you, in the early 20s. And now we're starting to realize, in many cases, that the zoning which is perpetrated in this world has created the mess that's out there. All your Burger Kings and McDonald's, all were approved by somebody with some plan someplace. Now, I have to be very sensitive about this because the dean of this school is an attorney, okay? But I will say the following. The majority of planning documents are written by planners who have no visual training for all practical purposes whatsoever. Majority of schools, although it's changing now. And this school is one of those schools that is changing that. But then, of course, they're given to the next most visually literate people, the attorneys. Oh, he understands that. He'll be smiling when I say that. But the reality of it is that what we have got out there all got approved by somebody. Downtown Muncie is dying. Why? Well, it's about as obvious as you can conceivably imagine. Everything happened on the periphery. It sucked the life out of this place. It sucked the life out of this place, not in Muncie, but every other major city in the United States. We're working on downtown Milwaukee. It's equally dead. Downtown St. Paul, equally dead. And the key of this thing is to the point of beginning to understand, in my opinion, that one of those major tools is going to be a zoning tool, which is not only a visual tool, but a way in which it begins to encourage the kinds of actions that we want to have happen. Now, let me see if I can get this thing. Oh, I'm going to go back and see if I can get this thing straight. Get this one straight. Okay, I'm going to go back on that one. There, I got it. This is the vision. 1950s some. Kind of what we were supposed to become and what we are. The average, there's now more cars in America, probably as you all know, than there are drivers. And this was kind of the image after the war of kind of the suburban American vision. I suspect that the majority of you grew up in this vision, and I ask, for instance, undergraduate students, and I teach one of those classes a year, and I ask them, what's a single operative word that describes the area in which you grew up? And that word is boring. Boring. To the point where I will even argue that the majority of people who moved to the suburbs did not move there for the kids. They actually moved there for themselves. Now, you will also begin to see on this combination of these two images, that the majority of plans which are out there are really this kind of these two-dimensional land use plans. And you see here one with all yellow, and standard land use yellow is low-density single family. And the red is strip commercial, which is put along the roads, given the fact that just about everybody was required or had to, or by necessity became an automobile-oriented person. When this particular image appeared in Newsweek magazine, which was the result of a one-hour conversation I had with one of their reporters after I had finished one of the surveys, and talking with Andres Dwani, Peter Calthorpe, and just about everybody else who's in the business, for the first time we saw a paradigm shift begin to occur. And that is the question of how viable is the future of the American suburbs? How viable is that, and what does that really begin to mean when the old image of the suburbs were dad, mom, and two kids? In the reality in America, only 25% of all the households in America are a husband, wife, and a kid anymore. 30% of the people in America never get married. So this whole allusion to the family and suburb is probably a niche market which is out there, but it in no way encompasses 75% of the rest of those folks who are really available to be able to make these kind of changes. Now, one of the things that we have found across the board, I do these really two simple diagrams for people. The first one is you start in the middle, you are formed, you grow, you optimize, and we try to optimize this with vitamin pills as long as we possibly can, and then we're on a downward cycle, which we know, and then we deteriorate and we die. And for the majority of you, it's going to be, 80 or so, some years. This new generation will probably live a little bit longer. You can expect to run to about 100. So you're going to see, most of you will still be alive in the year 2080. The amount of changes that you're going to see are going to be extraordinary, but at the end you die. Cities, on the other hand, go through a very simple, different cycle. They form, they grow, they optimize based on technology and finance, they deteriorate, and then they renew. Now, if you're a Buddhist, you may actually believe that you are reincarnated and you start over again. But cities do that. Historically, you know that cities begin to do that. So one of the first things we ask when we're working with a place is, where do you think the place that you're working at is in this cycle? Where is it? Where's the block? Where's the city? Where's the place? Where's the state? Where's the country? But you can typically determine where you are on that cycle. And the majority of clients that we have now are in the bottom, deteriorated to redevelopment state. Knowing that what's going to happen is the logic of the mechanism and the logic of this diagram is that they will always go through another level of growth. And they will go through another level of optimization. And that, of course, is the great kind of hope. Now, here's a classic for you. We work with a lot of major team structures across the country, and one organization that we work with a lot with is Cooper Carry. Now, this is Boca Raton before typical American shopping center, classic, and that's Boca Raton afterwards. What happened is they leveled it. Both shopping centers, 17 to 19 years, level them. Start over again. They die after that particular period of time. Now they've got a main street, they've got a plaza, they've got retail at the bottom, they've got housing up above that, they've got retail at the bottom with offices above that. It has transformed itself from the Euclidean zone of a single use into a multi-use place. Now, you're going to find that the majority of your work in your careers, I suspect, at least I think it should be involved not with the Greenfields projects, but should be involved with what we call retrofitting. I think that's what's interesting about the complex geometry of deconstructivism. The only redeeming factor that I can say about deconstructivism is that you folks will understand the complex geometries better than lots of other people will. Now, the typical planning vision process that we go through says an analysis of the physical, economic, and social, what we call the biography of the past. That's pretty normal, but a clear biography of the past. But the biography of the past cannot exclude you. it is much as important to understand where you came from and how you feel and what your background is as it is to the place in which you are building, designing, or analyzing. Then, of course, you look at the problems and opportunities. Then, of course, we talk about generating the vision. We do a lot of visioning, an extraordinary amount of visioning around the country. And then what we do is once we find out the vision and we show people images and have them rate them from a +10 to -10 based on 2 questions. Do you like it? And is it appropriate for Muncie or Indiana or Chicago or St. Paul or wherever we have worked? We ask the same question. And they rate these images. So we find out at some point there's going to be an image which is going to have an 8 mean with a standard deviation of 2. Which means everybody thought that that image was positive across all demographic spectrums. What we don't know is where they think that image goes, how it applies. So it's first captivating what you know is in your emotion and your mind, and that's that sense of vision which you all have. But how do you translate it from vision of what you have and everybody else has onto the plan concept? And that certainly has been truly one of the architectural quests. Then what we do is we test the vision politically and economically and physically. Then we create the street and building regulations. And what I'm proposing from an architectural and a planning perspective is that we scrap all existing zoning. And you start all over again with an illustrative zoning code. And number 2, we never build anything again unless it's tied directly to an armature. And by that I mean, think about it as the bones of the body. All of us essentially share the fundamental same armature, except no 2 of us look even remotely alike. What I'm recommending is no planning is done in the future anymore, ever again, until we build all the roads and street structures. We lay out every road and street structure and let the armature build onto that. Let the actual pieces build onto that, as opposed to letting it to the whim of developers or certainly leaving it to the whim of Euclidean zoning, which I think has truly been a disaster. Now, the Visual Preference Survey is a process by which the community participates, and I told you it's really about a way of looking at a series of images and rating those particular images. We have now, conservatively estimate, we've now gone through about 800,000 people have done this survey. We just finished our first one in Milwaukee, where we had our first 400 hits on the internet. So we're now moving it up to that level. I want to do a vision plan for, as we're doing in Maryland now, doing 10 of them around the state. I think we could do a vision plan for the country. I think we could do a vision plan for the world if we wanted to. Now, the technology is there to be able to do that. The thing that's also interesting about the time in which you guys are in is that we have never had the technology that you have available, but to do what? What do you do with all this stuff that you guys have inherited? It's only been available during your lifetimes to do something with it. We never could do the kinds of things we do if the technology was not available. Why is the technology available now to help us do these things? Well, there's a reason. And I think that reason is so apparent. And I think part of it is got to do with the way in which we think and the way we feel. The kind of the emotions of personal experience. I know that in my early days at MIT and before that, when we would do these black room experiments, and I did lots of experimentation with early slide stuff, that we would sit people in completely black rooms and, change and blindfold them and change the sound and find out how far they fell over and look at 1 projector, 2 projector, 3 projector, 15 projectors, 72 images simultaneously, and found out how their mind registered. What did they think? What did they feel? What was their blood pressure? What was their heart rate? And we started to find out that there was a correlation between the character and quality of the image of place and that blue line on that machine that said there's a certain things that makes me feel more positive. Now, what are these things? This is kind of the eternal quest that we're constantly going on. But we do know that the eye processes and the computer looks at and puts that stuff together. And that, I think, was really the reason as to why we developed the VRI, or the Visual Response Indicator. And it's really positive and negative. People said to me when I first started this, why don't you do this 1 to 10? I guess maybe it's that old kind of Dominican training that I had that said either it's positive or it's negative. Either it's good or it's bad. It's yin or yang. So if you say, how bad is it? Or how good is it? It's never either good or bad. There are values to both good and bad. And we said, let's value it at a very, very large scale. And that very large scale was a plus 10 to minus 10, and that's the formula. Now, every major thing that has been marketed in this country works off of that formula. Whether we're marketing a new Coca-Cola product, a new car, or we're marketing a plan for downtown Muncie. Now, what is this thing? The visual response indicator is your individual attitude and your individual basic beliefs. How moral are you? What's right or wrong? What's sinful or not? What were you told was right or wrong? Did your parents say to you when you came to a city, oh, what a terrible place this is? The first time you walked in the parking deck, did somebody say to you, ooh, I feel really scared here? How much has that affected your emotion? Why are there so many B-rated movies shot in parking structures? Why are people so frightened of parking structures? Why is the club shot in a parking structure? Because it's cheap to light and rent. But what has it done psychologically to everything else? What has Batman done for the future of the cities? We've been such an anti-city bent, and we're starting to find out that the people who really love the cities the most, and there are people who absolutely crave being that kind of urban environment, have a certain kind of background in terms of their attitude and belief. But then the other two are probably more important. Normative behavior. What's normal here may not be normal in Chicago or in Paris. And the other one is your motivation to comply. How much do you want to be like everybody else? Now, I was absolutely amazed when I walked into this room, or walked into the school, that there were so many people. I didn't see any earrings. I didn't see any people with tongue rings. I didn't see any purple hair. I didn't see any boots. I didn't see any whips. I didn't see any of that stuff. Now, what's your motivation to comply? Well, it's pretty high here. Now, some of you are trying to be rebels, and I'm sure you think it that way, but you kind of look at it and it's not. But what happens is your mind goes through this in about 4/10 of a second. With everything you see every time you experience something, and what it builds up is a sense of kind of an emotional positive high or a positive low. And what we simply do is we just have people put a value down. Now, in the old days, this is what we used to do. We used to write them out like this, and now we have very, very sophisticated computer readers. But look at 44 and 45. Why did 44, I asked myself, get a minus 4.17 and 45 got a minus 4.29? What was the value in these images? Okay, now you go to the images and you need to analyze these images. Why did this one go high and why did this one go low? What is the content? How much green does it have? Does it have leaves? Is it a blue sky? Does it look like it's fearful? Is there graffiti? Is there a table? Is there plants? And after you look at these images over and over and over again, there is a commonality to those sets of images. Now, what we typically find, it's kind of a reverse bell curve like this. There's always one image that goes positive, and it's the highest positive image. And there's one image which will always go negative out of a set typically of 240 images, which is a full survey. We do 80s, we do 60s, we do 120s, but 240 is a full survey, a good psychological profile. The highest rate we ever got for an image was a 9. I mean, if you get an average of 9, it's like nirvana. I mean, you've seen God. It's really this extraordinary experience. And interestingly enough, the most highest rated experience we got was in a barrio in Los Angeles when we were doing the neighborhood initiative projects. And what it was a series of Adirondacks chairs painted 3 different colors, bolted to the street with a bunch of plants and the sidewalk pattern painted on the ground. They got a 9.2. The next highest was a beach in Fort Walton, Florida. The pure white beaches with that wonderful aquiline sky got a 9.1. No other image. The highest image rated in downtown Milwaukee we just did was a 7.0. Which means that people are not even, there's not even places which can excite you so much that you feel this kind of wonderful sense of being. It's kind of like, oh yeah, it's cool. But not something that really turns people on. Now, what are those things that really turn people on? Now, let's take the opposite side of it. There's one image which is the most negative. Now, here's what we found. You take the components of the most positive image and the components of the most negative image. All the components of the most negative images will be in all the images until you hit 0. All the components of the positive image will essentially be in all the images until you come back down to 0. The most difficult images is 0 with a standard deviation of 6. Politically, it's political suicide because half of them like it and half of them don't. But if you've got images which are -4 with a standard deviation of 3 or 4, they must be avoided at all costs. The difficulty is that almost all suburbia in America falls at the minus levels by everybody across all economic spectrums, across all racial spectrums, across the board. Now, that's a pretty serious indictment. The next thing we have found is that you can isolate, for those of you who have the book, it's a thing called the design vocabulary, this elusive notion for non-designers of what design features are really all about. And we isolated essentially 20 of them, from building mass down to chimney types and what have you. And we can go and look at the images, the value of the image types, and then start to put a set of images together in terms of what people are actually looking for, because nothing is a single image. Everything is a gestalt of many images. A bright mind can take 13 receptors simultaneously. Look in the thesis things over there. Is there one board up? No. There's always 10, 12, 14. I would almost count that if we look at it, the average would be somewhere around 13, although I just suspect that without actually having done the study, but we could go next door and check it out. So what happens is, how many things can the mind actually take to really make this thing begin to happen? And again, you pull that out. Now, the key factor in all of this is question number 1. And that is, when were you born? Now, here's the way it's shaken down. If you were born between 1940, you are essentially a Depression thinker. Depression thinkers are 2 factors. It costs too much, we can't do it, and this is really going to be a problem. The other factor is, take what you can get, stuff as much money under the mattress as you can possibly do, and be satisfied with what you've got. Okay, then you have the next, the 41 to 44, and I'm in that category. Now, we are a bunch of really nasty rebel kind of people because we kind of grew up with lots of protection from mothers and no fathers during the war. It's that baby boomers, that 4-year group of people who think completely different than the rest of them do, because they not only understand Glenn Miller, but they also understand the Beatles, so they're halfway between the 2 generations. That's me. I can kind of understand both of you. I have a more hard time with the Xers, but I didn't get married till I was about 34. First child at 35, so all my kids have tattoos and pierced ears and all the rest of that stuff. So I think I'm getting some sense of that. But the bulk of the people in the system are 45 to 65, which is the baby boomers. And then you have the Generation Xers, which is the majority of you guys. And there may be some transition in between it. The Xers think completely different than the baby boomers do. For instance, baby boomers hate barbed wire. Xers are more tolerant of barbed wire. Baby boomers like urbanism. Xers love urbanism. Baby boomers tolerate suburbia. Most Xers think, well, maybe if my parents had it, depending upon how strong your motivation to comply, you fall into the same trap that your parents fell into. The other thing is, we found, for instance, a racial question. If you haven't had it, you've got to prove that you can get it. It's like most suburbanites, folks. Why do you need to live in a 6,000 square foot house, have a BMW and a Mercedes? Why do you need to do that? Because you have to prove to people that you have made it. And once you've made it, then you can start to really make those alternative choices. But until the motivation to comply says everybody else has got it, or I call it the J.R. Ewing syndrome. You've got to prove that you can make it. And once you've gone through that, again, things really significantly begin to change. Now, what have we found from the positive things? Positive places generate from a positive vision. That's always the quest. How do you translate this positive vision? What is it? And the other thing we found, that a positive response is the key to what we call value creation. It's value. That's all the baby boomers are interested in, as opposed to the Depression folks. We don't care how much it costs. We just want a return on our investment. Invest, but give us the return. Now, I'm not exactly sure, because you guys are not in that investment strategy yet, in terms of what you think, whether you're going to be more conservative or less conservative. My guess you're going to be more conservative. But the baby boomers, and when I said it was over at dinner, we were talking about this, what's fascinating about it now is because the baby boomers are now turning 52, 53, 54 at what, 10,000 a day, 12,000 a day. When every 7/10 of a second there's another baby boomer who turns over 50. They're saving. Why do you think everything is doing so well in this country? Because they're all saving, because they can see death at the end of the tunnel. So they're now saving as much money as they can possibly stick into the investment accounts. In 12 years, that's over. Then they're going to start making decisions, and then you guys have got the responsibility. We're going to spend, and you guys are somebody say you can get screwed, but we're not going to actually say that. Positive places do what things? They combine technology, ecology, ecological sensitivity, and physical humanism. Now, what do all of these things mean? How do you create a place which has got a sense of human scale? It has got to be ecologically sensitive. And it's got to be, you've got to take advantage of these technological opportunities. You can't bury your head anymore with the technology, and nobody is. I mean, the internet's the fastest growing thing now in the country. You can now order CDs cheaper on internet than you can in any record store in the country. You can buy plane tickets cheaper now than you can any other place in the country. Well, where's the interaction among people actually going to occur? When the major entertainment experience in the United States, which is shopping, has begun to move to some other places. So those issues of ecology and those kind of positive images are critical. But the other thing that we have found from some very early work that started with an environmental group of us, we did these little hands-on Mauro workshops. Now, these are the kind of New England prototypes that we created. We must have had at one point 10,000 of these little model pieces. And we gave them to people all over the country. We gave them to kids, we gave them corporate executives, and we said, if you've got this pile of pieces on a piece of land, make me a place to live out of this, or a hamlet as we called it, or a village. Now we did that, maybe 10,000 of these are done. Never can actually tell. And what happened is no two of them were ever alike, and every one of them was absolutely identical, no matter who did it. And we said, no, wait a minute, what's going on here? Because what we did is we gave them the buildings first, and put the buildings down, and then drew around the buildings, and then drew the lots, as opposed to the other way around. And what happened is there was a wonderful sense of kind of romantic organization. It was typically organized around some kind of a center square, and out of that came the principles book, for those of you who know the principles book. And it didn't make any difference where we did it. Everybody got involved in the same process, and you could see the beginning of a place was always an open space as a catalytic internal project that somehow or another every place was related to an open space. If we were in St. Paul, it was Rice Park. If we were downtown Milwaukee, it is the river. There's an open space which becomes the catalytic heart of most of these particular places as we began to see it. This was an old one. But what we found out is, what does it do? It empowers people to become part of the process. People are the ultimate user. I don't care how much you pay me. I will never know the workings of a place as well as the people who live there do. So the key is to tap that energy of the multiple set of people who actually live and work in a place and let them help you determine the plan. It's a market-driven approach. You know what you will buy. You know what you won't buy. You know where you feel comfortable. And of course, people really want to become involved as much as possible. Now, when I first started working in South, particularly in Arkansas, I realized that you could not begin any kind of public presentation without a biblical quote. And that was a given. I mean, I was this Yankee northerner heathen, but I definitely was not a Baptist, but I could not begin a lecture without doing that. So I scrambled back to my hotel, found the Gideon Bible, opened the Gideon Bible, and lo and behold, Proverbs. And Proverbs said, where there is no vision, the people shall perish. And there was, people said, where does this, George Bush said, where did this vision thing come from? APA did this thing about, 1965 was the first thing on visioning. Well, I beg to differ. But there's another one which is even more important. It said, plans succeed when counselors are many and fail when counselors are few. And that's really been the case. Where you try, and it's particularly difficult for architects whose ego is blown up to be able to be the creator of these things, to begin to understand that the more energy of people you can put on a process, the more successful it by nature will become. It's not a collective energy thing anymore. Although we need collective energy, it is really one that is, it is really that, not individual, but that collective energy which is really important. Now, what does it do? It gives us a character. It gives us the visual goals and objectives. I don't care if I ever see another comprehensive plan that says we want to preserve the rural character of this place, and somebody comes along and zones it for 3-acre housing. It doesn't mean anything. And so what I'm suggesting is, in order to really make that real, it's got to become visual, which this is becoming. Now, we got involved a lot with codes, and of course a lot of that is owed to Andres and Liz, for sure. Or Andy and Liz, as they're now called. So when Andy and Liz did Seaside, there's no doubt that a lot of us took a lot of what happened until we figured out Bob Davis and realized that the character of what was Seaside and what made it so successful was Bob Davis's desire to build it and to create a sense of community. Now, this little 80-acre piece has shook the foundations, I think, of planning, certainly in the United States. And so many of the rest of them began to follow. Whether you have Mashpee Commons, which was an old shopping center stripped out to go back to look like a Main Street again. Extremely successful by stripping out and taking the parking lot out and returning it to a street. My argument again in the armature is we go back to the beautiful cities that existed over time, and they were always laid out with a street pattern. I'm reading book London now, and it's really interesting to see where the first Roman bridges were in London and how that evolved over time with that same set of street structures. When did we abdicate our responsibility as planners to deal with the street structure? Well, we did that in the 50s, of course. And now, this book came along, and it was a really, I did a lecture like this, and I got a check in the mail for $40,000, and they said, turn that lecture into a book. But the Victoria Foundation wanted the first 2,000 copies of it, which I produced and did. There's 20 years worth of work in that thing. And it's just, somebody said, could you jam more ideas into one book? Well, that was probably the only book that I had time to write at that point, and that's what it was. And then, of course, the American Planning Association bought it, which I was forever grateful. I just now wish it was a little bit wider distributed than what it is, but nonetheless, that's where it is. I'm going to show you some of the results of some of the work that we've been doing, using the same process over and over and over again. This was the first one, which is a vision plan for Central Arkansas. Now, this, again, you can see the negative and unacceptable. It was a -4.3. Again, high tolerance for suburban sprawl, but the walk along the Esplanade got a 5.0. Again, not very high, but relatively high. On the opposite screen is the vision plan from the MPO plan. Now, you've never seen one like that before, I don't think. It's this whole series of little growth circles. The only place I saw anything close to that was the state of Georgia. In the state of Georgia, in the old days, they used to figure out where the town square was and swing a radius around the downtown and says this was the corporate limits of the town, which were all circles. We also know that the majority of people exist in a circle or almost a circular shape in terms of their everyday activities because they seldom walk more than 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes once you get out of college to be able to do anything. So you see, with basic ecology and then an understanding of what the growth numbers are going to be, this was the formation of some of the first ideas, including, as you can see on there, the thing called the computer commuter, which was an on-demand transit system which would go point to point, provided that you had a center of the community that you could walk to, running off a satellite. So that really actually started that first one. And these are kind of typical of these kinds of things that they really thought was really appropriate. And what we did is simply use this as a catalyst to create Brody Creek. Now, Brody Creek is about a 1,100-acre project inside the city of Little Rock. One family owned it. There were 3 houses on it. It's called Land's End, originally they called it. But this particular family saw the presentation on the visioning process that was done in Little Rock, and they came to me and said, can you take your concept plan that was generated by these people and turn that into an actual plan for our area? Now, this is a place that's got extremely 700-foot changes in elevation down to some relatively flat with 2 lakes with 1 lake in the middle. And what we did is you can see the same notion of the 5-minute walking distance around the various sets of circles. This was the first generated land use that was done. And this set us off into developing a new coding system. And the coding system was you lay out the roads the best you possibly can, and within the roads, you then do the concept, roughly the concept plan, and then you translate it into these, what we call building regulating plans. Starting first with the street regulating plan. Now, all the things we're doing, whether it's Milwaukee or St. Paul, it doesn't make any difference. All work now on the same set of things. Each road type is color-coded. So there's no questions in the survey thing anymore. You open the planning book, you see the plan, you see the brown road, you open the brown road, and inside the brown road is the section, the plan, and the regulations. Now, our latest ones are getting better because we have now model shop in it. So we have it like you're looking from an upstairs window down onto the street as it should look, all in the code book. So it starts to take a lot of that kind of mystery out of it. And then, of course, moving into the building regulating plans, which we think are so critical and important, and that is the notion of the lot, the encroachments, the parking, and the actual height restrictions onto the actual plan itself. And then, of course, we did a third step on this thing, which is called the design vocabulary. Here was always the most elusive part of it. What do you want these buildings to look like? What do they feel like? What are the details? And it took the same coding out of the visual book, but instead of actually writing a description for a beautiful arch or a beautiful entrance, what this did, it took the photographs and downloaded them to computers. That was even before the CDs were there. Now all that stuff is on CDs. So a developer wants to know what it is. You punch in the CD, and out of the CD comes a series of photographs that you want this thing to look like. Now approval is almost instantaneous. You got the right vision, you meet the road structure, and we meet the street regulating plan, and we're on our way. This is the first phase of it, some of the first sketches that were done, and it's under construction. Now, what's fascinating about this one is that it took 9 months. It took us 7 days to complete the design, 3 weeks to do the rest of the regulation, and with 9 months, we had it fully funded from the bank and under construction. 9 months. Now, why does that happen? It happened because it was a collective vision of the folks who were there. And the banks felt perfectly comfortable with it because it seemed like it related directly, and we had people who were willing to understand the design vocabulary was not something you just kind of passed off. And it's wonderful for us to see the first phases of stuff go up, and of course, it's nothing better than to see lots sold. I mean, that's really the best part of it. At different times of the year, some of the early plans, these were shot about 1.5 years ago. Now I want to show you another one, cruder. This is really crude. This is like a $10,000 job. Slam dunk, this one. I mean, all our clients are not the Wilson Corporation. We take on a lot of clients who come to us and say, hey, we got $5,000 or $10,000, and I go, well, okay. We'll take one of these, or if the project is interesting, and you guys know that because you do all these wonderful charrettes here as well. This was the one for Washington Township. Here was their vision. Now, you know, those of you who've been to Lake Forest, Illinois, you know what that place is like. I mean, the values of that was a 5.6. And they loved that place. They'd never seen it, but they knew intuitively that they really liked it. And then there was some of the 6.3, which is a kind of a new shopping village. And then, of course, you can see the big one was the 8.7, which was the park. Again, you can always see that the open spaces becomes critical because the values of these will consistently begin to go up. So what we did is we did a very simple set of things, but look at the comparison, if you will, on the left-hand screen here. If you can actually see that, the value, both of those images there is the new stuff that they've been building. One's a -2, one's a -2.7, and the other's a -1.6. Now, they built this stuff. This is in their code, and they did the survey, and it came out as negative. Now, what does negative do? Negative creates cognitive pain. Negative creates cognitive pain. When we ask people in sessions after these are over, when you gave it a negative score, what's the single strongest emotion you felt? You know what it is? Depression. I feel sad. This place makes me depressed. So the question of it is, classic as to why. And sometimes I ask audiences is, how many of you are on Prozac? And I always get lots of people who are raised on Prozac. I think half of America's on Prozac. But nonetheless, be that as it may, sketches of the preliminary layout, finalization of the design in terms of the using little models, spiffing it up somewhat. But notice this one, if you will. In the middle piece up there is their little main street. It dissolves into a square big enough to be able to have a field in it. And what I thought was fascinating is this is a range of housing types, but they also wanted a religious or a church at the other end, and they also wanted a cemetery. Now here's always my litmus test. If you got a PUD that's got a cemetery in it, it probably is a real community. Do you want to get shipped away to some place to be cremated and set in a field someplace that's not related at all to the places in which you have lived and grown up or the churches in which you worship? What happened to cemeteries next to churches? Well, they become parking lots. So this one is a very simple one. This is the road that's in front of it. And of course, this is a state highway. Now you're into the big hassles with the New Jersey DOT. And of course, that was always a good battle. And what we did on that one is simply we did a simulation. That's a computer simulation before and after. That's all it took was this bottom simulation to prove to them what that street could become. And we had converts from the New Jersey DOT. Again, that's computer simulation, and you guys probably know that stuff really well. This is the plan. I mean, again, the road structure is laid out, street structure is laid out, and the fundamental location of the buildings are laid out. And then here's the typical, the actual ordinance itself looks like this. Again, color-coded streets, which are fairly simple and straightforward. And this was a cheap document, so what we did is we simply black and white them. So you just color them in black and white in terms of where you want to go. And then the various street types are the same plan, just done over and over and over again in the same kind of overall character. And you can see how the street regulating plan evolves and the street that begins to develop because of that regulating plan. Very narrow streets. We were really interested in very, very narrow streets. This is one in Portland. We like that. It got really high on the survey rating. It's a terribly, people can't pass, but it's the most human street there because cars have to stop to pass each other. Now, in most cases, you can't build a street like that because you're supposed to have 2 fire engines and a 3rd fire engine passing at the same time in order to make that street work. And I was just blown away today when I came in here on a highway, was 76 or 67, I don't know, whichever it was. It looked like an airport runway. I mean, it looked like the Cincinnati airport. And it had no cars on it. It had 2. I'm going, why are they widening this sucker? Why? Why are we wasting your money on a road we don't need? Why? Well, again, I will say it's depression thinking, but on the other hand, guys like Rick Chelman now are really making big words and big moves with IIT and AASHTO and those folks to get these kind of road standards changed. And it's happening. And you can see it through here. That's the typical kind of boulevard section. And of course, the ubiquitous alleys. We don't do anything without doing alleys anymore because you get the best streetscape off of alleys across the board. And even trying to deal with the highway system in terms of creating a boulevard, actually the highway was always a very critical one. And then I'll start to actually lay out some of the actual neighborhoods itself. It does have some of these numbers in it by nature of it, but you also begin to see these diagrams where you concentrate the highest density in the center is start to be ways in which you begin to do it. You see the building regulations here, and this was the commercial component. Again, the whole thing was done in about 40 pages, the whole thing lock, stock, and barrel, including the townhouse plans. Now, you're going to see if you look at this carefully, you can do townhouses or garden apartments. You can do several building types in the same street. It's not Euclidean where just one building type fits on a certain street. You can do multiple overlays onto a single street. And again, the regulations look as simple as this. They're all one page, and you refer back to the design vocabulary. So those are all really a neat part of it. And you can see the narrow lot lines also fit where the townhouses could fit. What it is, it allows the market that if we get a great street with great trees and great sidewalks on, and the market says it's better to move to townhouses than small single-family houses, why should we be regulating what the developing community and the market says you should have? As long as you have great streets with great sidewalk, who cares? As long as we get the quality we want. So that becomes a slightly different way in which one begins to look at it. And again, they're always relatively simple in their overall configuration across the board for each of the actual building configurations and types. And you can just see the whole thing just goes on in this kind of configuration, whether it's senior citizens housing. And what's nice about it, I think it all falls into a fairly simple, straightforward process that a lot of the architects can then play with. So it gives the architects creativity. Now, you remember that top-rated image? That open space top-rated image? Well, you can see that part of the open space part of the plan now. So now what happened is the people who actually rated these images now can see that image in their plan. Now, I don't see myself as a planner anymore. I simply see myself as the facilitators of other people's vision. We're just there to help them put it into place, and that's what I'm asking you guys to become involved in. Giving the architects, of course, the most flexibility in the process of developing the actual civic buildings. I want to show you another project. This one was fascinating. We just finished Midtown Atlanta. Now, if those of you who've been to Midtown Atlanta is just, it's 2/3 of Midtown Atlanta is empty parking lots with some very good signature high-rise building in, but it is a really terrible place. We went through a visioning process with them as well, but this was interesting about this because our working group was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, every major developer, all the major bankers in town, and every major mover and shaker was on our executive committee. We went out to the public. 2,700 people participated in the survey, and we came back and held one intensive charrette that boiled itself down into a final set of design plans. And you can see the context here, and you guys probably know that stuff fairly well. That was the street regulating plan. We developed 37 of those things. 37 bankers sat there. In fact, we started at 9 in the morning and then finished at 5 in the afternoon, and they had this catered white tablecloth lunch, and none of them went to lunch. Guys, stop. It's time for lunch. We could not get them to lunch. They were so involved with their purple magic markers and trying to figure out where this stuff went. And what we found out is that, I mean, if you look at that, the woman who's sitting there, Carolyn Thatcher, is head of the Georgia Conservancy. I mean, she's got more money than God. And Carolyn was in there totally engrossed in this project, as was almost everybody else who ever becomes part of it. And you guys know that because you do charrettes here. But what happens is when you lay 20 overlays for street structures on top of each other, you're going to find that 80% of them put the roads in exactly the same spots. Now what happens? It's their plan, not my plan. And I think that, but what we need is the architects to help translate it. Now here's something we're trying to push the envelope on. It's called three-dimensional volumetric zoning. Of course, computers can now do that. To the point where now you really start to do the zoning again in the zoning code, but we're dealing with some fairly substantial infills of structures. And so what we're doing now, we're primarily doing this in microstation with the major road structures laid out, but what it does, it really starts to lay out where the various land uses and the volume into which things can be built, and then related that back, of course, then to a design vocabulary. Starting first with the basic structure, and here's two things that we have developed, which I think are very important. This map here, essentially, is what we call a susceptibility to change map. And if you remember nothing from this lecture tonight, the most important thing that I can tell you is the development of the susceptibility to change mapping. Now, why is susceptibility to change mapping so critical? When we say susceptibility to change, we say what things will change in the next 40 years. Now, top on our list, our hit list, of course, is parking lots. There will be no more parking lots in the year 2050. So parking lots are highly susceptible to change. One-story buildings, highly susceptible to change. Existing deteriorated structures, highly susceptible to change. Then you have highly, medium, low, and not changeable. So you wind up with a map that has these 4 characteristics on it, and then you three-dimensionally volumetric all of those buildings which are going to stay, and you take this back to the community and say, do you agree with this? Now, that's all the buildings in Midtown Manhattan that group agreed was going to stay by the year 2050. Now, what do we do with the rest of them? Well, obviously, you go back to the visioning process, and that began to pull out things like major structure, where the major roads were going to go, where the major sidewalk configurations were going to be located, and then you started to infill it, primarily with housing. All the yellow and the brown here are low-density housing. And they kept, because we went back to their maps and they said housing, 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 and here was the configuration of the housing types. So for the first time you can see in this particular photograph 3 variations on the types of low-density housing they're looking for and where they're actually located in the plan. So not only could you see them, but you could also see the volumetrics, and the volumetrics could relate to a photograph. So here's the synthesis that begins to occur by putting several of these kind of pieces together. And then, of course, you do these kind of diagrams. The typical kind of floor plate diagrams of as simple as you can conceivably get. Here's the floor plane, here's the courtyard configuration, here's the height relationships, and here's the parking. And of course, each piece of it obviously can be pulled out in a separate extract. Now what they'll do is they go and they pop the CD into a machine like this, and anybody who wants it, you automatically pop up the zoning. It's all there for you in the volumetrics that you want with the volumes already figured out, with the photographs to relate to what it is that they actually want, approved, of course, by the financial and the development community. Now this starts to get some things a little closer. That's a big green square in the middle, and it's really an abstraction. You say, well, what does that look and feel like? Well, of course, then we would default back, of course, to the actual imagery. And you can see some interesting variations on that thing as you, and of course, the computer system now allows you to revolve around it as fast as, and wherever you actually want to actually go. I'm going to show you another one. This one is now on your website. 1,000-acre downtown Orlando. It's the old Navy training facility. We won the competition against Andres Duany and Peter Kelthorpe to do this plan, so we were selected to do it. It was done with the visioning process of the community and 7-day workshop that developed the whole plan. The plan then went out for a set of design regs, which we developed, and then went out for an international bid competition, which will be announced on May 1st. 4 international bidders are bidding to build this thing right now. The whole 4.5 million square feet of non-residential use and 5,000 housing units. One master developer, one fell swoop, right in the middle of the city of Orlando. 7.5 months to do this one. Why it works so well is you've got a complete buy-in from the neighborhood and community group because they helped us design it. Again, using the same kind of process, using the lakes, you can see some of the major connections. There's a digital photograph. Stick it into Photoshop. Take off the pieces of Photoshop, gray them down, and all of a sudden you got the boulevard structure. Reverse the system in Photoshop, and you got all the building configurations. Reverse it again, and you got all the road configurations. One digital photograph, one set of Photoshops. Again, the technology you kids got available to you, that's never been available before. I mean, it would have taken us years to do this stuff. And then you come into the sets of plans now we're developing, which are really the required road structure. So this is the minimal road structure. Every developer had to do this as a minimum. So if you did the minimum, you could do it. If you did the next suggested, and if you did the total package, we'd give you instantaneous approval. So they had 3 choices of optimization on the various pieces. And these, you may not realize this, but this is Rick Chelman's sections of the street type. That's one of the foremost, I think, new traffic engineers in the country. And you can see there's a level 2 and a level 3. The optimization of the plan, so if you did that plan and that configuration with those road structures, essentially in the way that was laid out, it would have got instantaneous approval. You could start building 2 weeks from now. So it's the ways in which the planners and architects are really playing a kind of a role that they've never done before. And this is the way the plan was presented. It was done essentially in PowerPoint, in Photoshop. And it was all done kind of instantaneously. Again, by the end of the 6-day charrette, all these images were done, of course, downloaded from lots of other places. And then this was what the design regs looked like. So there's sets of photographs and kind of volumetrics. I want to close on one last project. This is a project we're working on in South Africa. This was a 2-week project. This is a town, which is interesting about this one, is that they have hired RTK out of Baltimore to do a 3.5 million square foot shopping center, and they hired us to do the rest of the town. And this was done with a team of about 60 people. It was done in a very short period of time. And what we did in order to convince them of it, after again going through 2 visioning sessions there, was to actually create the 3-dimensional model as a way of beginning to translate the vision directly into a 3-dimensional vision of what the town could begin to be. And some things that, I go back to this kind of old notion of working with these models, which I still find quite old-fashioned and really quite wonderful, was the view boulevard here, for instance. I mean, making a boulevard that for the first time just didn't go straight, but splayed out at the end. So that any place along that boulevard, and if you go up at its site, you could just see for miles. So that notion of being able to sensitively begin to look at that with whatever tools that you've got to be able to do it, it became clear to us that people loved these long views. It was really almost like when you're talking about filling in the proportions of space, the 1-to-1 is a wonderful notion. But what's really sacred to most people is 1 to infinity. So that 1 to infinity view is just, it's the closest thing to kind of a spiritual revelation you're going to get. So we just said, well, what happens if we just made this a view of boulevard that you can overlook these hills for the next 50 miles? Well, of course, it had its immediate connection with the ability to get the stuff kind of transformed. What I'm suggesting, of course, is that through all of this stuff, and again, just to kind of conclude this stuff, that there's these 3 pieces of it. And this is what, if I could do anything to get schools to begin to understand the enormous talent which is sitting here and the enormous direction that this can make in the future, if we can learn to communicate not only among ourselves, but we can learn to communicate with those folks out there and let them become part of the process. Don't use yourself as an ego to create something. Let yourself become a vehicle to synthesize what other people think they want. That's a kind of a new reversal of roles that says that I think because you've got this talent, you also have this responsibility. And that's what I would like to ask you to do. That's what I'd like you to start to thinking about as part of this lecture tonight. Start to think about what your new role is in this whole process. And think about the fact that nothing is going to get done until you lay the street structures out. Every street, forever. Or open streets. I mean, the disaster downtown that happened in so many downtowns that never should have happened. To reopen those streets, to reconnect those grids, to get rid of this hierarchy of places and hierarchy of street systems, which DOT has told us was so important. To start to think about building regulations, which is uniquely what, in most cases, architects and landscape architects and planners can do. And of course, the design vocabulary is a matter of photographic memory and cameras. Of course, now CDs, and I mean, you can go to Corel Draw or some of those things on the internet and download 10,000 images if you want. But who can do that? Who puts the magic collection together as to what it is that people actually want and what they feel comfortable about? And I think that's what you guys can do. I think that's what's so important about what you guys do. And I think that's the role that I think we all must play in this new evolution of a place. Because clearly it's changing. And it's going to change really radically in the next 50 years. There's no doubt about that. And I think the part of that is the most exciting time. I mean, it's the most exciting time ever to begin to happen. And I think it's really up to the baby boomer generation to set the direction. And it's up to the Xer generation to do it. It's just do it. But do it correctly, do it right, and do it in the point where you've got the best respect and honor and sincerity from the people around you. Thank you guys very much.
We have a few moments if there's some questions from the audience for Tony. Anyone? All right. We have someone in the back, please.
Higher class development. How do we take a lot of the stuff that you talk about and relate it to our redevelopment areas, not gentrify, but empower those people in those areas to take some of the same principles and do some of the things?
What's interesting about it is that, it's a very interesting phenomenon. Let's talk directly about the Afro-American community. The Afro-American community has been one of the least participants in our process of all the community groups. There's essential fear of the process, and there's a fear of actually participating in the process. We found that the only way we could do this is they will not come to us. They will not come to us. I don't care what we try to do, they will not come to us. We must go to them. And that really is the whole difference in the approach to this project. We just have got to go to them. And we have found the biggest collections classically through this particular group is either through direct community groups or directly through the churches and ministers. That's the only way we could find it. And the other thing we found out that the males are the worst, quite frankly. It's the females in that particular group who are more sensitive to these particular issues and have been able to draw us into these communities faster. So it's really been very problematic for us, particularly in the Afro-American community, to do it. Less so in the Hispanic community, but more so in the Afro-American community. So what we have been trying to do, to the extent possible, is to try to tune it directly, to the extent we possibly can, to actually get into these communities by an extended reach out. Because we know now, just by our experience, that by the nature of it, let's say, to give you an example, Milwaukee. Milwaukee has a 17% Afro-American population. We got an 8% participation rate. Well, that's not good enough. So what we will do, statistically, is interesting enough, we will then cross-sample that particular group. So we'll extract that group by itself, look at that group by itself, and then run them back to the whole computer as a statistical valid sample, or try to take them as a statistically valid sample. We would love to get more folks involved. And when we get involved with the inner city thing, particularly people who, for instance, here's a classic one, renters as opposed to owners. Across the board, it's always been typically more stakeholders, renters, will come out, except for the first time in Milwaukee when we did the internet, interestingly enough. All of a sudden, we got lots of renters that we never got because renters simply don't have time to participate in most of these surveys. So that was a way in which we got more renters than owners for the first time. But I will tell you the majority of our work, I am becoming more and more anti-greenfields projects all the time. I really am. I'm almost starting to think it's immoral to think about another greenfields project. To the point where the excitement of it is, let's say Columbus. We've just been interviewed for Columbus, whether we'll get Columbus or not. But it was so depressing to drive through Columbus and see miles upon miles of just dilapidated, boarded up buildings with primarily Afro-American folks living in it. It was just depressing. So what do we do about that? How do we activate this thing to really begin to happen? How do we get people to begin to understand? For instance, a classic that we tried out, and this is really a sad indictment. The white folks are so scared of black youths, it's almost unbelievable. Put 4 black kids on a corner in any place and the white community is shitless. Now, why is that? The power that that image relates is just beyond comprehension to me sometimes. Now, how do we deal with that? How does the black community deal with that? So these are kind of issues that I think are so critical to begin to get into these communities to try to understand what that stuff and face the honest reality of it. That's what a lot of us have not been able to do, is face the honest reality of how we deal with these problems. Now, when we have been successful with that, and I think we've got some really wonderful successes, we have gotten some extraordinary results. But things I never expected. I mean, there were whole different ways of relating to open space that I didn't expect was going to happen. But on the other hand, there was so much commonality when we looked at it across the board. Just about, in some cases you could say it doesn't make any difference whether you're black or white, red or green. It doesn't make whether you're Catholic or Jewish. It doesn't make any difference. People want the same stuff. How do we deliver that same stuff, that safe sense of urbanity, that sense of being, that sense of green? Just the sense of green, the sense of clean. For instance, I worked on a project in St. Louis, primarily Afro-American Afro-American kids. And it was really an incredible set of sessions. And this was for the new train area going through some of those areas in St. Louis. Now, we had these folks for about 2 days. The vision was absolutely extraordinary. But one of the things which was interesting about it is that, for instance, tremendous amounts of trash and pile up and rivers clogged and what have you. And they said, we're not going to pick it up. But if somebody picks it up first, which they've neglected for years and years, then we will keep it clean. But we are not going to pick it up first. That was pretty intense. And then the image of what we need with the kinds of things, and finally when they get enough confidence that you will actually listen to them, that you can participate in the process, you get ideas which make so much sense for that community, where things should go, where the daycare facilities go, where the translation, where the education facilities, how to get the jobs. All became part of the whole visioning process. And that really is the wonderful thing about it. But it's breaking that notion that I'm just not a white guy with a white group of people. I will do whatever I need to do, hire whomever I need to do to get people to participate in this process. And if you don't like me because of my color of my skin, well, then I'll hire Joe will go out and do it. I'll hire Joe to go out and do it for me, like he did the public housing projects for me. I couldn't walk into the housing project, but he could. And his survey just blew us all away. It blew the community away. It blew everybody away in terms of what those folks wanted. So it's how do you get the trust and accessibility? In South Africa, we're going to do a Zulu community. I don't speak Zulu, but we're going to do it visuals. So it's that notion that we keep pushing that envelope to try to find out how we do this. How do we make this work to the point that we get as many people into the process as conceivably possible? Huge impediments, but we certainly have learned a lot in our last couple of years by doing this stuff. Anything else? Yes, sir.
A lot of the illustrations that you showed us tonight of projects have been, it seems to be new projects, so we started with a clean slate. We were talking about laying out everything in advance. How has it been to open direction with the problems that we have now, that you can use this process of visioning and some of the principles of new urbanism to come back to an area that's already developed and draw upon that example and redevelop it and make those corrections and modifications to improve the current built environment without demolishing it as illustrated in one of the projects in downtown Woollen?
I would probably think that if I came back here 1 year from now we'll have finished downtown, the county and the city of Atlanta, Georgia, where the University of Georgia is located. We have that under contract to create the zoning code for that one. We have the city of Milwaukee under contract to do the city of Milwaukee, which is, again, very much of an urban situation. We're working on the city of Orlando now, and we got our first crack at a real urban situation when we did Midtown Atlanta. So those are the ones that are starting to formulate in the kinds of things that we're doing now. The direction of the office has kind of changed because my direction has changed. Kind of a notion that I would much more like to become involved in the end of my life with the redevelopment of cities as opposed to doing more greenfields projects. So you can start to see the kind of the tenure of the projects that we're working on now is definitely starting to move more and more and more in that direction. And that's going to be a battle for us. There's no doubt about that because it's redefining whole sets of new urban codes that have not been redefined before. So we're on the edge again. So I would guess in about another year or so, you're going to see some of the results of both our trials and our successes in these two cities when we really dealt with these new kind of urban codes as opposed to. But I suspect that they're going to be similar to the things that we have tested in other areas, but they're going to be more of the vintage of Midtown Atlanta, which we just finished last December. They're going to be more of, we're pushing that envelope now more and more and more.